Hey guys, it's Micah. Welcome to another Philosophical Tuesday. In this podcast, we explore interesting ideas and brainstorm solutions to problems fundamental to human existence through the simple discourse of a few friends. Thank you for joining us in our attempt to uncover the truth behind some of life's greatest mysteries. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Welcome to the Intellectual Stooges podcast, where we talk about philosophy and sometimes make sense. I'm here with Joshua Charlton.
What's up,
Josh?
What's goody, Micah?
It's good, man.
That's great. That's great. I'm here with the original soulless ginger, Josh Smith.
What's up? Yeah, it's me. And I'm here with our host, Micah Young.
Yes,
who is going to make the
together.
conversation slightly less awkward because the other two of us are awkward.
Well, I'm
sorry if your mics were up there. It's going to make somebody deaf.
Yeah, really.
Well, that's kind of the point of this.
I think it did kind of automatically mute it. But anyway, so today we're going to be talking about something that we all have a ton of experience with, which is total sarcasm, because we're going to be talking about parenting. Specifically, we're going to be talking about. I mean, this podcast is going to be, we're going to try and make it philosophical in nature. We're going to try and answer these questions about how things should be, how things are, get in some psychology and some ethics and some morals, maybe a little bit of theology. We'll see where it goes. But today we're going to be talking about sort of answering the following question. Are parents responsible if their children turn out to be terrible people? We'll start by just bounding the conversation just a little bit, and then we'll just get right into it and see where things head. So, just to repeat the question: are parents responsible if their children turn out to be terrible people? We're going to assume, for the sake of the argument, that the parents aren't doing something to seriously hurt their child's development. So, we're not talking physically abusive parents or neglectful to the point where the children are starving or are getting absolutely no adult interaction or attention. We're just talking about parents being bad parents, as you might see, some relationship between a middle schooler and his mom when you're at the mall, and you just don't understand how people can act that way towards their kids. So we're just going to get into this question. So
and just for the sake of clarity, you mentioned a parent acting the wrong way towards their child in the mall, for instance. But I think that kind of assumes that parents are, to some extent, responsible for the way their children turn out.
Well, that's the question we're asking.
I think we could even debate something more fundamental, which is what exactly does it mean for a child to become terrible or for a child to turn out badly?
Sure. Do we want to start with that question? Because it's hard to
my
talk
question
about
would be, what age are we talking about here? Because in my mind, there's a big difference between, say, a 6-year-old who lacks moral agency, and you could say if you saw a really bratty 6-year-old, okay, that's definitely the result of poor parenting, versus a 20-year-old who has turned out to be a terrible human being, but has, at that point, they're fully conscious of their actions, they have moral agency. To me, that's a really important distinction.
That point is crucial, because nowadays we have a lot of 20-something-year-olds living with their parents still, even up to the age of 30. You often see people still living with their parents. And so, to a certain extent, I would still consider those people children, to the extent that they have not separated themselves from their parents.
I guess my question is, are we talking about, when we say responsible for their children turning out as terrible people, are we talking about them having terrible children versus them raising terrible adults, which is, in my mind, two different questions.
Right. It is. It's we're not, I don't think, let's keep the conversation away from bratty children and a child being bratty in terms of that being the outcome that we're looking to understand. I think we're looking more.
We're talking for the ultimate outcome.
We're talking for the ultimate outcome, adult.
Okay.
And honestly, if you're an adult, and going nowhere with your life, and you're still living at your parents' home and acting like a child, we might consider that one of the possible outcomes here. But really, we're looking at you're 18 to 22, right? This is the age when, you are moving out of the house and going off on your own. What kind of person are you leaving the house? Are you leaving your parents' home? If you are leaving your parents' home, what kind of person have you become? What have your parents done over the past 20 years to make you into who you are? And if you're not who you should be, how responsible are they for that? And how responsible are you? Is maybe you might argue genetics could be some. We could talk a little bit about nature versus nurture. So there's a lot of things we could get into here. So,
yeah, and I think the nurture side is really important, especially if you're talking like 18 to 20-year-olds. They've definitely undergone some changes and had their own responses to certain kinds of parenting styles. Like by the age of 18, they basically should have been taught by their parents to go out in the world and kind of forge a new path for themselves rather than relying on their parents for the rest of their life.
Why is that their parents' responsibility to teach them that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean,
hold on. I have one more question of clarity before we dive into the meaty details here. We're talking about them turning into a terrible human being. We're talking to the age range of a young adult. When we say terrible human being, are we talking about? I mean, let's be honest, most young adults are just in general, pretty terrible human beings, just by nature of being young adults. They're selfish, they're self-absorbed. Like it or not, that's kind of just part and parcel of the age range. Fair. So are we talking here regular young adult, self-absorbed stuff? Or are we talking like extraneously terrible 18 to 22-year-old, the kind of person that other 18, 20-year-olds look at and say, okay, this person is like, nobody wants to be around this person. They're just a terrible, terrible human being. Like, are we talking like part and parcel? You'd be hard-pressed to find an 18 to 22-year-old who's what you would consider to be a moral example of how you would want to live your life. Right. And in my mind, there's a big difference between, again, if we're having this conversation, I'm assuming that we're talking about the extreme, the 18, 20-year-old who goes out and robs a convenience store. We're talking about the extremes, not the average generic 18, 22-year-old who does some underage drinking and smokes weed.
I think to some extent those conversations are difficult to separate, and the reason for that is because there's a spectrum on which you will fall based on certain parenting styles. So obviously, if you look on the far end, there's going to be psychopathy, and those people are pretty screwed up, and they'll go like rob a bank or whatever. But you'll still see perhaps narcissistic traits without the inclination to go full out psycho mode.
Right.
Towards people like closer to the middle, and then you'll see see moral deficiency. Like, I think moral deficiency is the key here that we need to explore.
We're looking for moral deficiency beyond what someone really. And I mean, we could talk. You might say that the average parent in society is probably not a good parent, and that's kind of a whole. That's not really what we're asking here. I think what we're really asking is when somebody is more of a hurt to society than they are a help, and they're really not performing to what they really ought to be for their age, when they're really, when they are living at home and just doing nothing. I mean, there's good reasons to live at home when you're in your 20s. Because you're playing video games in the basement all day is not one of them. So I would, I'm not, and a terrible person probably wasn't the best word to use here. I mean, we might think just not a functioning adult. We're not even talking
how about not
adult.
Properly suited to take on
that would be a better
the
way
world
of
on
it,
their own. To not properly suited to forge their own path through the world. How about that? Or is that too loaded?
Maybe we'd be better suited limiting it more to just their individual bad actions. So if a 20 something year old does something immoral, is that the responsibility of their parents?
I agree. Let's start with that, Joshua Charlton. We'll start with that, and then if we come to some sort of wraparound on that, maybe we can start talking a little bit more about these vaguer things where it's not so much they're acting in a explicitly immoral way or taking these immoral actions.
It's really hard. It's really hard when you're talking about these general questions to go so general and so abstract. We really need to talk about maybe some specifics first, and then we can build off of
and
that.
then hopefully we can uncover the moral underpinnings of all this. But first we have to examine the evidence.
So I have what I think is this would be my off the cuff answer to this question.
Okay.
And maybe I'm wrong about this, and maybe we'll find that out. But this would be my off the cuff response. And if you disagree, let me know. It's my general belief that once you hit the age where you have, say, moral agency, you're capable of knowing right from wrong, it is no longer the responsibility of really anyone outside of yourself when you do something wrong. And my reasoning for that is that if we take bad parenting, and not even extremely bad parenting, we're not even talking about that, right? We're just talking about maybe mediocre, subpar parenting. Nothing terrible happened, nobody was abused, nothing like that. Just maybe weren't the world's greatest parents. That is only one of countless factors that can negatively impact somebody's life and can provide a legitimate excuse as to why such and such a person turned out to be a terrible human being. That we all go through things that could be given as an answer as to why it is that this person, or you, me, is turned out to be a bitter, angry, resentful human being. We all have experiences in our lives that could provide a basis for that, and understandingly so. And really, and that's so prevalent in I think all of our lives, that really the main question is, how is it? It's not the question of how does somebody turn out screwed up. The question is, how does anybody not become that, given how horrific and troubling life really is, and how much suffering is involved in that. And that is that is one of the most universal qualities of being human, that we suffer, all of us, terribly. A lack of good or excellent parenting is only one, and not the biggest by far, of a great many factors that can contribute to that suffering.
So you're almost proposing that we shouldn't be asking the question, are parents morally responsible if their children turn out bad, but is there anything that parents can actually do to keep their children from turning out bad, would be the question you're looking at.
I guess I would try to flip it around to a certain extent, because to me it's no wonder that people turn out terrible. To me, the real wonder is that anybody turns out good at all. And
I think, to interrupt, I think part of the reason that there has become such a societal inclination to put the responsibility on parents is because we have shifted the blame about certain things onto different we've given culpability to different agents other than the children themselves. For instance, children are incessantly being diagnosed with PTSD or other sorts of trauma, and so then they can just use trauma as an excuse for why they, maybe not an excuse, an explanation for why they are behaving a certain way or why their actions are impacting people in a certain way. And I think the tendency for psychoanalysts and therapists to pronounce that upon young people has led them to shift the blame off of themselves for certain actions. And so I think in this another question arises that might be worth discussing, which is whether children can be terrible in the sense that we described it and be conscious or unconscious of it. So is it possible to be a terrible person and be completely innocent in the sense that you have no idea that you are doing these things and acting this way?
It sort of it sort of raises this question of perhaps the one of the things we're asking about parents is is there any sense in which the parent is responsible for instilling in the child that sense of responsibility for their own actions, at the very least, that sense of moral responsibility. In a world that is increasingly amoral, in a world that is increasingly, we might say, seems to be messed up on a societal level, there's not as many societal norms that are keeping children from going off and becoming these adults that don't contribute to society or can't handle society or can't handle the world. They become these adults that view themselves as victims of, in this case, it's kind of of what their parents did. It's
rather than adults, they are grown-up children.
And were they ever? Is there a responsibility that falls on parents to make sure that at least they have a moral conscience that is able to recognize that I'm doing this. It's wrong, but I'm doing it. There's a difference between I'm doing this and it's wrong, but I'm doing it, and I'm doing this because I feel justified in doing it.
I think that there's no question that parents have a moral responsibility to teach their children right from wrong. That's a separate question than do they have a moral responsibility for their children doing things that are wrong.
Well, if the child does things that are wrong and does not have a proper sense of right and wrong, is that the child's? We could say that in an ultimate sense, it's at least legally, you might say that the child is responsible for that, right? But is there a duty? Is there a moral weight that falls on the parent, specifically when their child fails to recognize that they're making a moral choice and they're doing a moral wrong? Is that
what do we mean by child? What's the
offspring? We'll say so their child grows up, did not learn the difference between right and wrong properly, and then
let's say an 18-year-old for the sake of argument.
Sure, yeah, that's a good example because they're right on the border. They do something. They were taught that if they wanted something, they should just take it. So they just went, and it's a dumb example, but they decided that.
No, you make a good point.
Well, they wanted a candy bar, so they stuck it in their pocket and walked out of the gas station. That's a silly example. People do that all the time, but they've just committed a moral wrong. They were never taught not to do that.
Well, and there's a lot of evidence to back up your point that children who witness their father, for instance, beating their mother or stealing things himself or lying or being an alcoholic, those kind of traits passed down to children, whether through example or some sort of genetic factor such as alcoholism. But yeah, you raise an important question. Josh, any thoughts on that?
I think we're going to start getting into a conversation here regarding objective morality. Is morality objective, and if we do something that is wrong and we don't know that thing is wrong, do we bear responsibility for that? And that does, first of all, we are assuming in that question that there is such a thing as objective morality, there is such a thing as right and wrong, and this is where I think we're going to run into some fundamentally religious questions here. I don't think we can answer this merely philosophically.
Certainly.
So we could go that direction with it. Another thing we could do would be to kind of pull back, and rather than making this about parents teaching their children the difference between right and wrong, we could make it more about parents ensuring that their children understand the consequences and the reasons to do right or wrong. Not just that this is right and this is wrong, but that there are reasons to do right and there are reasons not to do wrong.
Well, and I think that the right way of parenting is to teach your children through the consequences, like you're explaining, rather than to just say this is right and this is wrong as if they're facts. I think proper parenting will demonstrate through example and through consequences whether certain things are right and whether certain things are wrong.
Well, and that's what I meant. It wasn't, when I
Yeah,
said teach,
yeah.
I don't mean tell. I mean instill in their children. And if a parent doesn't instill that in their child, is there a sense in which the parent is culpable for the fact that their child is going out and doing these things, even though the child, in this case, we might even say, may know that what they're doing is wrong. They just simply don't care.
Well, and I think it goes back to what Josh raised about objective morality, because perhaps the parents are not aware of the ways in which they're misleading their children either, which I think...
But why aren't the parents aware?
Because, well, going back to the objective morality thing, like,
well, now we're going to end up into a chicken before the egg argument.
Yes.
No, but it is a chicken before the egg argument. Anytime
but
you talk about this, it's a chicken before the egg argument, because every parent was raised by a parent. And
True.
so somewhere along the, if we're going to have this discussion, we have to acknowledge that somewhere along the line, if there was a duty that was shirked, it just trickled down to everybody.
Now we're going to start talking about original sin, aren't we?
All right, so we had to take a little break there to reset our video call, but we were in the middle of talking about, we were still talking about the parenting question, and we had been talking about what do parents... Oh gosh, somebody remind me what we were talking about. I have a short attention span.
We were basically discussing what culpability parents have if their children turn out to be terrible. That's as far as we'd gotten.
Right, but yeah, go ahead.
Sure, we had kind of gotten into whether parents were innocent, just like children might be innocent when they do wrong. Innocent in the sense of not knowing what they're doing, and how that relates to objective morality. Well, and I think... Go ahead, Josh.
I mean, I do think that there's a fundamental question here of if you do something that is... If we are assuming... Are we assuming, for the sake of this conversation, that there is such a thing as objective morality?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We can't have this conversation
I think
otherwise.
we have to.
Yeah. It's a moot point.
Then the only question that really matters here is, if you do something that is objectively immoral and you don't know about it, do you bear responsibility for that?
And that is a very fine line to walk, because then we'll have to get into like the really tricky situations.
And I will add, I never suggested, and this, it's not my point. I'm not going to take ownership of it, but I don't think we have to assume that just because the parents bear more weight, that the child bears no moral weight. We can say that a child, an offspring, we'll say offspring because, again, let's use good terms here. Prodigy. The prodigy commits a moral wrong. The prodigy, we could grant that the prodigy is morally responsible. Is there a moral weight that falls on the parent too, because their prodigy did that, and they could have theoretically prevented it?
I think that is going to depend on the circumstances. I think if you're going to ask whether parents have a moral responsibility or moral culpability in the way that they teach or train or instruct their children, then you could definitely argue yes. But when you're talking about the actions that a child commits, and in this example we're talking about an 18-year-old, I think we have to go back to what Josh brought up about moral agency. Once a child's old enough to have moral agency, it seems a hard case to make that someone else can be responsible for their actions.
Yeah.
And now we're right back to the question of to what extent their parents or other authority figures have influenced them in their actions. And I think that's what we're getting at right here.
And I do, to me there can be simultaneous. And again, I think Micah, I think you're both right. I think Mike is correct in that parents can bear responsibility for failing to be good parents and failing to instruct their children. That is a different thing than saying that the parents bear responsibility for particular terrible actions that their children took after their children are old enough to have moral agency. And to me, that's a really important distinction. So I think it can be true, and it depends on how you're saying this. I think it can be true to say that parents bear responsibility for teaching their children right from wrong, and teaching them why right things are right and why wrong things are wrong, and that not doing that is a moral failing on their part. And it can also be true that if you are 18 and you commit a crime, you do something that is wrong, you do something that is immoral, that is nobody's fault but your own, and you bear sole responsibility for that. And those two things are not, in my mind, exclusive. So to me, it's a matter of do they bear this responsibility for the particular action, or do they bear responsibility for their failing as a parent, which is two different things. And your answer might change depending on which of those questions you're actually asking. And again, the reason I'll go back to this. The reason why I don't think that parents I don't think they have the right to assume responsibility for the individual actions of their 18-year-old. I think that, not only do they not, I don't think they have the right to. And my reasoning for that is very simply that, again, their moral failing as parents are only one of countless possible excuses that could be justifiably used to attribute to this 18-year-old and said, okay, well, maybe he didn't have terrible parents, but maybe he had, maybe he was physically abused by a classmate, or she. Maybe they had some horrible things happen to them that weren't related to their parents, and everybody has. You'd be hard-pressed finding somebody who hasn't had some great tragedy in their life, some great suffering in their life, that could be used just as, I'll put this in quotes, but legitimately could be used, again, at least in their minds, to justify why it is that they've turned out to be this horrible, terrible person. And to me, it's no wonder that people turn out that way, given how horrible life is. That people become these bitter or resentful things is no wonder to me. Again, I said this at the beginning, but there's the real wonder is how anybody turns out good at all. And so if we're going to assume that everybody has, if bad parenting is justifying bad action, there is no bad action that is not justified by some other past suffering, past injustice that you have gone by. So if we're going to assume that moral agency exists at all, which it does, we cannot use bad parenting or subpar parenting as an excuse for poor behavior when we wouldn't use all of the other things as excuses for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think you made a really good point there. It kind of ties back into what we were talking about earlier about moral agency and about how we tend to focus on external factors rather than internal transformation in bad behavior these days. I think the internal transformation is important because it often, the bad behavior often stems from a wrong, well, Aquinas would have called it like a wrong ordering of desires. Your desires are in the wrong order, and if you're putting lust or greed at the top, then of course you're going to commit bad behaviors. And he argued for like transforming them in ways that point you towards Christ. But yeah, I think you're really right in that point.
I mean, if we were, I think you touched on this a little bit, Josh Charlton, but if we were to, and it relates to what you said too, Josh Smith, if we were to pick out parenting and say that there are all these external circumstances that could be reasons for acting immorally, if we were to pick out parenting and say this one in particular, we're going to put moral culpability on this external reason, we could do that with any of them, and ultimately if we just withdrew all the moral culpability from the person committing the wrong and just made them a victim solely of their circumstance, then nobody would ever be morally culpable for anything. They would be purely a victim. And so if you want to have if you want to have morality at all, you can't extract moral responsibility from somebody for the sake of their circumstances unless they're acting under duress, and that's a whole different discussion. But it's different than acting because you have a reason. Having a reason to do something is different than being under duress to do something.
Being coerced to do something.
Coerced to do something, yes. So does anybody have anything more to add on this? No, and we can kind of take it a different direction.
I think that's exactly spot on.
Well,
I think if you're going to, as you say, take away that one element, you're going to focus on that one reason. If we're going to use that logic applied to its natural, taken to its natural conclusion, means that no one has any moral agency for anything that they do. And unless we're prepared to see that, to me, there can only be one answer to this.
Agreed. Do you guys mind if I bring up another point that might take us down another rabbit trail?
Sure.
So I guess my question for you two is, it's something I was thinking about a bit today. I was reading The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt, and he brought up an interesting point about let's say collective morality, or rather collective strength. So something that isn't typically considered, it's something that's typically considered amoral, strength and resiliency. But he described it as something that could perhaps be related to whether our children turn out to be good or bad. And an example he used was allergies to peanuts. So back in the days when there were still peanuts in schools, there were a few children that were allergic to peanuts, and as a result, there were like a couple really bad incidents, and so they basically pulled peanuts out of school entirely. And as a result, they began to notice more and more children developing allergies to peanuts. And what they realized was that in withholding the peanuts, the collective was becoming weaker because they were not exposed to something that they could interact with and therefore grow stronger through. And so in trying to protect very strongly a few people who might develop severe reactions, they ended up endangering the entire population of the school, because then if like peanuts got introduced into a school with like 50 kids with peanut allergies, then there's a real problem on your hands. So my question, I guess, that I'm trying to introduce is whether we think that strength or resiliency has anything to do with this topic.
I mean, it's certainly...
In whose strength and whose resiliency?
The resiliency of the children being raised to go out into the world on their own.
In other words, could negative parenting actually be beneficial in the sense that it
Well, not negative parenting, but parenting that exposes children to risk. So all we've talked about so far is parenting that is kind of like the treadmill walk all over you parenting. There's also, I mean, in traditional psychology, there's like the distinction between authoritarian, like the hard asses, and the permissive parenting, which just refuses to expose their children to anything in the world lest they somehow die in a tragedy. So there's obviously a balance between the two, but I guess my point is to introduce this kind of permissive parenting and to what extent strength might be related to morality.
I mean, that was one of the other things I wanted to bring up is what are the dominant parenting philosophies today, and is there something wrong with some of them? Is there some that are preferable to others? So I mean, I think permissive parenting is a great thing to segue into. Yeah, so taking the conversation a little bit of a different direction. Rather than talking about whether or not parents are more responsible, let's talk about the quality of parenting itself. Let's talk about what can happen. What are some things that parents can do that can cause their children to be less ready to take on the world, regardless of needing to define exactly what properly ready is to take on the world. Charlton, what were you looking to say?
Well, I mean, I think there's no question that the kind of, as you say, that kind of permissive parenting, or maybe I'm not understanding. When you say permissive parenting, what do you mean precisely?
Well, permissive parenting, technically speaking, usually refers to parents who are not strict and basically allow their children to do whatever they want without guiding them.
So are we talking about permissive parenting, or are we talking about protective parenting? I think we may be talking more about protective parenting, because you're talking about not exposing them to things.
Yes.
So that we could talk about both. Let's start with protective, because that's what we're on.
Right. Yeah, so
I think I misspoke in framing it.
So if we're going to talk about protective parenting, I think there's no doubt that being overly protective of your children is definitely a negative. And I think we could all agree that the times in our lives where we grow the most, where we learn the most, are basically universally the times where we're going through the hardest stuff. You have to be allowed to face challenges and overcome challenges in order to grow as an individual. And there's a responsible way to do that, obviously, as a parent. I'm not saying you should go and, I'm not saying you should have no rules, no restrictions, none of that. But there's a certain degree of risk that you have to allow your child to take on so that your child can grow and learn. Otherwise, they just will never grow up. I think that's plainly apparent.
So what is that degree of risk? Where do you really trying to find that line?
And that it's hard because we're going to start getting into some real specifics. So I think that I think we can agree that there's moral imperative on the parents to teach their children right from wrong, and why right things are right and why wrong things are wrong, right? I think there is moral imperative on the parents to protect their children from things that would be of moral or unjustifiable danger to them. So things that could cause them, permanent physical harm. Where there's a difference between saying, hey Jimmy, don't go running out into the shooting range, versus saying, hey Jimmy, don't go slide down that slide. Right? There's mortal danger that has to be protected from, and then there's kind of the regular physical risks that we encounter that are reasonable risks that we encounter that ought not be we ought not be as sheltered from.
Right, and I mean that's a good clear-cut example, right? I mean, in one case there's an obvious death risk, and there's always a death risk, but that one's like it's there in your face.
It's an unreasonable.
It's different. It's an unreasonable risk, right? We wouldn't put ourselves in that situation, let alone let our children be in that situation. Whereas if Jimmy falls off the slide halfway down, he's going to get back up. He might even break his arm, but he's going to get back up.
And the other thing that I would add to that as well is there's that physical side of things, there's the moral side of things, and then there's the moral side of things in not exposing children to things that they are not morally ready because of their age to actually conceptualize. So for example, I do not recommend that you as a parent go showing pornographic material to your 6-year-old. They do not have the moral framework
which
to
some
understand
parents
that.
have done.
Some parents have done that, and that is child abuse. That is wrong.
Well, and the rationale behind it is my child is going to learn about these things anyways, and they're going to discover it for themselves. So they might as well do it accompanied by someone who can guide them.
And again, it doesn't mean you have to shelter them unnecessarily, right? Like if your 6-year-old, to me, there's no reasons why a 6-year-old can't understand. If you're they see your aunt changing your cousin's diaper or something, like you can explain to them some of the basic realities of things like gender, but they don't need to know everything. And there is such a thing as holding as being restrained and introducing moral concepts when your child is ready for them, and that is going to depend on the child and on the parent And so that's not something that I can say, okay, well, here's the one age where every child should be introduced to this particular concept, because it is going to depend, and it's going to come down to the judgment of the parent for their individual child. However, there is a line to be walked there between sheltering your child too much so that they don't know anything, and also exposing them too quickly to things that they ought not be exposed to.
Right, and I think that you're bringing up a good point that relates to permissive parenting, the kind of parenting that allows children to be exposed to way too many things before they are ready. And I think one major aspect missing from that is discipline and knowing how to respond to authority correctly. A lot of children raised by permissive parents do not know how to interact with authority figures, and the reason for that is because they have not had they have not had clearly outlined sets of rules laid out before them that they are taught how to respond to. And that is something that the authoritarian parents have down pat, but don't know how to allow that risk in. And the correct parenting is clearly somewhere in the middle, where you teach children how to mitigate that risk while at the same time, or how to navigate that risk while at the same time still knowing how to respond to authority.
It just occurred to me that we need to be careful how we define this discussion, because I think there are two axes here that we're talking about. The one axis is this question of, are we being authoritative or are we being permissive in the parenting? The second axis is, are we being sheltering or are we being exposing? So you've got a very authoritative, very permissive parenting on one axis. On the other axis, you have children being very much overexposed versus children being very sheltered. Now, there's going to be some tendencies for the exposure and the permissive parenting to be on the same side, and the sheltering and the authoritative parenting to be on the same side. But you could have parents who are very strict and authoritative who are exposing their children to everything. And you could have parents that are very very liberal with how they treat their children, who are trying to at least, or very liberal with what they let their children do, who are at least trying to keep them in a context that doesn't expose them to too much. So there's two axes there, kind of like on the political spectrum.
Right. Like there are parents who kind of set up their little bubble, like let's say their house, and let their children run free and do whatever they want inside that house. And there are other parents who let their children go out into the world and explore it for themselves, while at the same time making sure that their college student calls before leaving their dorm or something crazy like that. So you do have those. It's not quite as clean cut as we presented it, but so you're right in that regard.
And I do think that if we're gonna let's shift the conversation and talk about authoritative versus not, because that is, while it's related, it is a separate conversation. I think what we were talking about, which I think was largely focused on that sheltering
exposure
versus exposure,
level exposure.
And so if we're talking about authoritative, for people who are not completely, non-authoritative parents, I think that's obviously a disservice to their children, because the reality is that your children need to learn, right, as Josh was saying, how to properly respond to authority, because for better or for worse, our societies are structured in the hierarchies that they are in. You're going to need to know how to place yourself into that hierarchy, how to read where you are in that, how to learn how to interact with other people in that hierarchy. And if a parent establishes that there's no such thing as hierarchical relationships, your child will have no way of conceptualizing that by the time they hit 20. And that I think you're seeing a lot of that right now in today's youth, where they have no respect for their employers, for example.
Or they don't take their jobs seriously.
They feel entitled. That's where that kind of entitlement mentality, I think, really comes from, is not understanding of that.
I've seen the parenting tendency that you just talked about carry over to the employers. Some employers simply do not have the expectations for their... They don't want to be authoritative towards their employees. I mean, having worked in food service, I can tell you that the employers acted like they were their children's parents a lot of the time, and they were not authoritative parents. They were parents who let their children get away with whatever, so long as their children felt okay, so long as their children were happy, and what ended up happening was all of the good children, we're talking the good employees, were very frustrated because they thought, what's the point of being good if everyone else just gets treated the same?
Right.
You're also seeing the same type of thing in schools, especially with the rise of technology, and it basically seems at this point that it's very difficult for teachers to be able to get phones out of students' hands during class, and or even if you're looking at grading systems, let's say, children have easy access to Quizlet or to the answer key in the back of the book, and often teachers lay down expectations and don't care how the result is achieved as long as it's achieved. And so you often see children who are just kind of messing with the rules and getting the right result, getting the good grades, but not really putting in the effort. And you definitely you can definitely argue that those students are responsible for their own moral decisions in that regard. But I think it's very hard not to argue that, not to agree rather, that teachers or authority figures who make it easy to break those rules and get the right result are not in some ways culpable.
Josh, can I pick on you for a second, Josh Smith?
Yeah.
When you were in college, being your roommate, I noticed the ease with which you were able to procrastinate papers because your professors were always okay with you turning in your papers late. Did you feel, and you didn't feel bad necessarily for always turning in papers late because there was you didn't feel like it was a moral issue. Now, I'm not even saying it is a moral issue, but there was an expectation that was laid out that your paper would be done on time, but that expectation was never enforced. So can you even, and this is again a different question, but it's like, can you even call an expectation if there's never any follow through to it, And
I think that is a really difficult question because it relates to the state of the university, which is rather difficult.
It's tied to the state of the high school and the public education system.
It is, and a lot of that leaks into the university system, but I think a lot of that just comes from a lack of setting clear expectations for people our age in general, because people our age and older are still children. And I think it's, instead of saying, look, we have way more children than we should in our society, let's turn them into adults. Instead, the desire has been to turn our culture into something geared towards children, because we need to protect them.
Just turn civilization into a giant padded playground.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, a giant padded playground.
So pull this back into the parents' discussion then.
Well, I think
take it from education back to parents, because it applies.
Yes, it does, and I think it's the same fundamental issue in a certain sense, because I think it's a hard question to answer still, because we're still kind of on the issue of culpability, and we've already addressed objective morality and how children are responsible for their own decisions. But I think that regardless of where the moral culpability lies, there is an underlying necessity for parents and other authority figures to make their own moral decisions in teaching the children how to become adults. That should really be the main role of parents.
They need to be constructing
authority figures.
They need to be constructing the children's conscience, because there is a natural there's an element of natural conscience. But if you're given expectations and those expectations are never enforced, you're never going to build up a conscience that says there is an objective right and wrong, and I need to follow that because for the sake of right and wrong,
I think that relates directly to the point I brought up about strength and resilience. I think that through teaching children consequences and through teaching them to follow procedures and respond well to authority, you are teaching them, and on the flip side, exposing them to the harsh realities of the world, to maybe even the very chaotic and unpredictable nature of existence itself. I think in doing both of those things, you are helping contribute to kind of crafting this productive member of society who is able to take care of themselves, to be able to grow up and raise their own children, to be able to jump into a job, an occupation, and perform their tasks diligently. So I think at its core, those issues are very intertwined.
So just to tie together what we've been talking about here, I think in the course of this conversation, we've delineated 3 fundamental responsibilities of parenthood. There's the responsibility of teaching right and wrong. There is the responsibility of teaching why it is that right things are right and wrong things are wrong. And there's the responsibility of enacting a system of consequence, of rewards and of punishments in order to demonstrate not only that things are right or wrong, that things are right and wrong for a reason, but that there are natural consequences, good and bad, for the enacting of those 2 moralities.
Yeah, I think that's a great way. Is
that going to be? Are those 3 elements going to be sufficient to develop resiliency? The resiliency that Joshua Smith keeps.
I didn't say that was all that there was.
I'm not saying
the 3 that we had.
And I didn't think you were saying that. I guess I'm trying to extrapolate what other elements, what other key elements can we draw here? Because we were talking about resiliency. I mean, there are other virtues, you might say. And these, what you just listed, wasn't necessarily virtues. They were like things that parents are responsible to do.
And I think I have a quick answer for that, and it's going to be a cookie cutter answer. But in the same way that parents are not morally responsible for the bad choices of their children, you cannot teach your children external virtues and expect them to be a perfectly productive member of society. At the end of the day, the internal transformation is going to be necessary. A relationship with God is going to have to be what directs them in the way they should go. And that's something that you cannot just enforce.
So in response to Micah's question, I think the answer would be that these 3 things are the responsibilities of parents. But as to the question of are they sufficient, it's whether they are sufficient to the creation of a moral individual, ultimate responsibility for that falls on the individual itself, not the parents. So the 3 are the responsibilities of the parents, but even the question itself, is it sufficient for that creation? Well, no, because it's not the parents' responsibility. Parents'
it might contribute to it, but it's not going
contribute.
To be.
But is it the full contribution? Is it on the part of the parents? Is it a sufficient contribution to say I have done my duty? Because I would agree with you.
I think we've already answered that, right?
So, but you've pointed out 3 things. I'm just asking, is there more? I agree with you that yes, parents can never do something sufficient so as to ensure that their child, apart from any inward transformation of the individual, their offspring, will say. Because again, don't want to pigeonhole this into small children, but their offspring, there's only so much a parent can do, but how much is that?
But to clarify here, we're not talking anymore about a matter of sufficiency, of efficacy. We're talking about a matter of responsibility of the parent. So it has nothing to do, and that is independent of the efficacy of that, because I think we've already established that ultimate responsibility falls on the child themselves. So we have to let's be specific about what we're asking here.
We're
not asking, are there more things that the parent could be doing to ensure that their child turns out to be a good person? We're talking about, are there more qualities aside from the 3 that we listed that parents are responsible for doing to their children?
I'm good with that. Okay. So we took another quick little break, and we're getting right back into the discussion. We just determined that We're not talking anymore really about moral responsibility on whether the parent is morally responsible for what the child does. We're actually more talking now about what is a parent morally responsible for just as a parent. Like what are the traits that they're supposed to instill in their child? We came up with 3. We said they need to teach them the difference between right and wrong. They need to teach them why they should do right things and why they shouldn't do wrong things. And I believe the third one was Josh, help me with the third one.
I would clarify the second one. Not that they should teach them
Sure.
why they should do right or why they should do wrong. They need to teach them why the right things are right and why the wrong things are wrong.
It's good clarification, yes.
And then thirdly, they need to instill a system, an understanding of consequences for moral actions. So that there are rewards for doing good things, and there are consequences to doing bad things, and they need to instill that. So it is a parent's responsibility to punish a child for doing something wrong, and vice versa, to reward them for doing something right. So those were the 3 main responsibilities that we had found through the course of this conversation. So now, as I understand it, the next question is, can we think of any more aside from those 3?
And I think it's going to be difficult to attempt to do so, only because there are a lot of different perspectives through which you can look at this issue. And the one that we've followed it through has, I think, held water. I mean, I don't think that you could dispute any of the claims we've made so far.
We don't need to be exhaustive with it either.
Yeah, we don't.
One thing we haven't talked about at all, at least I don't think we've talked about it, is work ethic. I don't know that that's assumed under any of what we've said so far.
I would think that with the 3 things that we had already talked about, and this is where things are going to get tricky, because the 3 things that we talked about are very broad.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So we could specify more things within that. What are the actual values of right and wrong to be instilled? But so, for example, if we're going to talk about instilling the value of work ethic, that already falls in what it is we talked about. We just haven't listed that as a specific right that ought to be taught. But the 3 things that we talked about, I think, flowed pretty naturally out of the conversations that we just had. I'm having a hard time thinking what we could talk about that doesn't fall under that umbrella. And do we actually want to be adding to those things, or do we want to now be taking it inward and looking, okay, what are actually some of the right and wrongs? Or at any of those 3 points, what specifically are we talking about in any of those 3 points?
Well, let's throw out some things that we think that are good characteristics, good virtues that should be present in children. So work ethic would be one of them. And how does we could talk about these things, and do they fit under those 3, or do we need to add something? So let's circle back to work ethic, because we were still talking about resilience earlier, what we might define in a moral sense as steadfastness or integrity. The ability not to be moved on a moral position or an action of the will, of a position of the will. Does that fall under the definition of what is right? Does it fall under the definition of consequence? How does that fit into there? Any thoughts on that?
Perhaps you could rephrase your question a bit.
Yeah.
So with you were talking earlier a lot about resilience and about you're raising kids and they're going to become adults, and they're going to go out in the world, and they're going to be faced with difficult moral decisions. They're going to be faced with moral decisions that weren't in this sort of simulation. That it's not a full simulation when you're a child. I mean, when you're parenting a child, sometimes the consequences are very real and very direct, a result of what you did, not imposed externally. But there's also times where it's very much a simulation. It's toned down. So resilience, steadfastness, we might call the ability to act morally in the presence of strong opposition.
Well, and I think a lot of times, and this is just an interesting point I thought of, is children often see the world more clearly than adults do. And the reason for this is because they are innocent. They don't have all the bias, and they don't have all the bias behind their judgments.
Okay, I have a 4th thing.
Okay, let's hear it.
And let's see if you guys agree with this. I'm going to hypothesize that it is the responsibility of a parent to, in a way that is reasonable and safe, at least in the sense of not posing any kind of mortal danger, or morally mortal danger even. But I would posit that it is the duty, responsibility of a parent to provide challenge in a safe and controlled environment, to provide challenge and risk and opposition for their child to overcome, so as to give them the opportunity to grow.
Yes. And that relates directly to what I was saying, because children see the world more innocently than adults do. The only problem is when they are navigating a situation, they have no idea how to navigate it. They are like stuck without someone to guide them. They can maybe see it more, understand, or not understand, but they can see more innocently the way that the world works even, but they're completely like floating in the water when it comes to coming up with solutions to how to navigate it. I think that's a good point to bring up.
Put a civilian on a boat out at sea and they might wander at the ocean, but they're not going to know how to get anywhere. It's a child can appreciate life and the world in a way that adults can't, but they can't necessarily do anything with it. They need guidance. They need a path.
So now
they need to have experienced it.
So we're talking now, in addition to the three that we've supposed, we're now talking a guidance through the waters of life and through the challenges that are going to arise in that life, and also a necessity to even introduce challenges and obstacles for their children to overcome. And maybe the best example of that is just as simple as schooling. To provide challenge for their child to overcome for the sake of helping them grow and to guide them through that challenge.
It's sort of, I don't know if it's a fifth one. It might be. There's also a duty of the parents to provide a resource, and this isn't just a duty of the parents, but the children must learn, and this is part of facing challenge. But the children must learn to use the resources that are available to them. One of those resources is their parents. One of those, the wisdom that has been gained by people who have experienced things before. One of the resources is the moral code that they're given, and the experience that they are given. But knowing how to tap into those resources, that I think is a big thing that people lack in terms of knowing how to interact with the world. It's not that they're not resilient. It's that they're faced with a problem, and it's not even that they're terrified or they cower initially. It's that they don't know what to do. And then it's when they don't know what to do, when they don't have a course of action, and when they don't know how to pull their resources, then they cower in fear.
And I think that goes back to the authoritative style of parenting we were talking about, in which parents guide their children on how to respond to authority, on how to be able to be resilient. And you mentioned morality, learning how to be confident in moral choices once those moral choices have been decided as good.
So we're talking really about the introduction of wisdom as well as morality.
Wisdom, yeah.
That's kind of what I was getting at, yeah.
Yes.
We could even redefine. I don't know if you'd separate morality. You could keep morality and wisdom separate because they are different things. Morality is very absolute, very. It's right and wrong. Wisdom is experience and application.
Yeah.
You might say wisdom is the product of the exposure to challenge, but the thing is, you can't rely purely on exposure to challenge. You have to rely on external wisdom. So it might not be, certainly parents aren't the sole source of wisdom for someone who's growing, especially once you become an adult and move out of your parents' house. Your parents may remain a source of wisdom, but you're going to have other sources of wisdom besides your parents. But there must be a source of wisdom, and maybe even teaching their children how to seek and appreciate wisdom. It might fall in with the how to deal with the challenge part, because that is one way to deal with the challenge, is to it's not only to present them with challenges, but to give them, but to be there as the guide, for when they have the challenge, as an available mentor. They're not just presenting them with the challenge and saying go at it. Sometimes they have to pull off. Sometimes they have to say, I'm not going to help you this time. You need to figure this out for yourself. They always have to be there to at least say that,
So now I think we've identified, what are we at, 6 now?
I'm not sure we got any. I'm not even sure we got to a 5th one.
Well, if we're gonna draw these out, I mean, I think they're best kept. They're all related, but I think it's best kept them into their individual points, just for clarity's sake. So there's the establishment of right and wrong. Mm-hmm. The why is right, wrong, why is wrong, or why is right, right, why is wrong, wrong. The institution of consequences for moral or immoral actions. The guidance through, 4th would be the guidance through challenges that a child might face. And you might say 5 is the institution of additional challenges that are necessary for the development of that child. And then the last one was the last one? Josh had said it.
Repeat.
Resilience? I don't know what you're getting at.
I'm not sure there was a. I'm not sure there was a. Repeat the 5th one for me a second.
The installation of additional, the implementation of additional reasonable challenges that enable your child to grow. And so the example that I had was schooling.
And how's that different from the 4th one?
Well, the 4th is maybe, say, guidance through the natural challenges, challenges or otherwise. Maybe there's a proper order there. Maybe we ought to put 4 as the implementation of challenges as they're necessary for the growth of the child.
It could even be exposure to challenges, not even implementation of them, but also exposure.
Yeah.
Okay. And the other one, the 6th one that I couldn't think of was the implementation of wisdom. And to define that more precisely, it's what Micah was talking about when he's talking about the application of how do I take the moral sense that I've collected and apply that to the particular circumstance.
Is that strictly different from understanding why right is right and wrong is wrong?
Well, if there's a difference between understanding why it is that right things are right and why it is that wrong things are wrong, and being confronted with a difficult situation and not knowing what to do about it. So you can have the general understanding of the general principles of right and wrong, and still come upon a difficult situation where you don't know what to do. It's not the clear path doesn't present itself obviously to you, and the solution to that ultimately is wisdom. It's learning how do you apply those basic principles that you already know to that particular situation and navigate through it.
So we might tie 5 and 6 together.
You might tie them together.
I think we could tie those together as just one.
All of these things are tied together, right? So there's
these are they're tied together. Lines. But for the 5th one, we might just combine them and say the impartment of wisdom.
That may be a better one.
And you might even say that. Go ahead, Josh.
I was just saying. So 4th would be the addition of reasonable challenges into the life of a child that helps that child to grow, and 5th is the implementation of wisdom to help them navigate the challenges they may face.
And I might add that just as we're seeing advancement in these stages of training children or offspring, so you will see the advancement of the offspring. So in the same way that these stages are progressive, so the development of the child will be progressive. So I think you can correlate the two.
I mean, you might argue that these things, even though they have a natural logical order, they actually have an order to. They follow the
chronological instruction of a child.
The chronological instruction of the child. Yes. When you have a toddler, you're just teaching them.
You're
do
teaching
this.
Right from wrong.
Don't do that. You're teaching right from wrong.
Yeah. No, I think that's actually a pretty astute observation.
Mm-hmm. You're not going to throw a huge challenge at your toddler and say
no. But
because they have to go through those stages first,
right?
Those first few stages.
And I think that order is probably fairly correct. Where first you're teaching them just right from wrong, then you're teaching them the whys, then gradually you're introducing consequences, and then finally you're and 4 or 5 come together. The implementation of challenges into their lives and the guidance through those challenges, and the impartment of wisdom. So I think that's probably a pretty fair order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. did we also want to talk about the last question that you raised, Micah, earlier, about how the community should react to bad parenting?
It is a sort of a different question than we've discussed tonight.
It is a bit different.
I guess the one thing we might do is we might take it from being parents in terms of like your actual children, biological children, or those who have been taken under your wing in a sort of a like a guardian sense, going kind of stepping out from that a little bit. What is our role as adults? We're all adults. We're not parents of anybody, but we're at least adults. Okay, we understand more than teenagers do about how the world works, and we have more wisdom than teenagers do, even though we certainly don't have as much wisdom as our parents. How do we react to a situation where we have a child whose parents clearly have been neglecting some of those duties, or haven't been really? Most good parents don't necessarily think through these. A lot of good parents don't necessarily think through these things, right? They're good parents because they've seen an example of good parenting, or they simply know that this is what a good parent ought to do because they were parented well.
I don't think anything that we said here is some great revelation to anybody who's been a parent.
We just articulated a lot of things in a nice, neat,
lived out
orderly
parents,
fashion. Right.
Every day. So,
but what
we're
happens
honestly
when we
just trying to kind of put into words something that
Mm-hmm.
people act out, probably without putting so much thought into it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So then what happens whenever we see a situation where, how can you provide some of those elements in an appropriate fashion outside of being the parent,
So are we talking about how we respond to the children or to the parents? Because I think it would be interesting to explore how, in the same way authority figures hold children in check, how society holds authority figures in check. But I'm not sure if that's exactly where you're going.
I was thinking more of the children. We could talk about the parents too, though. I mean, it's like it is one of those classic questions. It's like, what do you do when someone else is being a bad parent? We have this culture where it would be so taboo. You would never criticize someone else's parenting styles to them. You would never say you shouldn't do that as a parent unless it was like something they were doing was horrendous and like obviously a moral wrong. You wouldn't tell somebody they were being a bad parent. So that would be an interesting to explore too. How could you do that?
I mean, I think that you do have to be so careful because people do get so. Obviously, this is the most important things in people's lives, and so we might before
they certainly
we talk
think of
about,
it that way.
Yeah, they certainly think about it that way. Feel that way. We might first draw some boundaries. What are we not willing to do? Let's assume, and again, let's assume that we're not talking. We already kind of said this at the beginning of the conversation, but let's assume that we're not talking about child abuse. Parents not physically abusing their kid, they're not emotionally abusing the kid. It's just they're failing to implement any of the five traits that we've talked about.
This is now the situation where you see the kid. Let's not use the example of the mall because there's no relationship there. Let's say you're at the baseball field and you see a parent. You have a little league team and your child's on the little league team and you see this parent that's just absolutely just
yelling
being
swear words at the kids,
just like, being or just putting them down. There's all number of things you could be doing.
You could be doing anything, or even the kid itself is acting out in a horrible
Right.
way, and the parents standing by not doing anything. Everybody's
Right.
seen this. It's not child abuse, but it's bad parenting. And so to me, there are a few things that we ought to first of all restrict what it is that we're not willing to do, because to me there are some things that societally, even though there are things that may be very, very wrong, the things that we have the right to do to intervene in those situations to me are important. And so, for example, I don't know that if a parent is failing in any of these five areas or is perceived to be failing in any of these five areas, we societally have the right to say take away their children. right? I think that's something we could probably.
No,
Right.
no, that's I wasn't even like thinking along.
I know
those-
you weren't,
more,
but I'm trying to just restrict, right? So
right.
I think we can definitely agree on that.
I'm not, but my point is to restrict, right? So I think that's off the table. I think that forcing parents to enact certain parenting techniques that you think are correct on a societal level is probably pretty off limits for us. Am I correct in assuming that?
No, I think you have to maintain the right of the parents to raise their children so long as they're not literally destroying them.
So we have to. So then the question becomes, what do we have the ability or the responsibility to do?
Well, and I think before we get into this, we need to recognize the way that parents were traditionally kept in check to a certain extent, which was primarily through the church.
Right.
Educators also had a fair amount of responsibility when it came to kids. Like, I know we weren't really talking about child abuse, but when it came to issues of child abuse, educators have often stepped in.
Right.
And of course, the introduction of the government has played a huge role in how parents are responded to. So I think we need to recognize that there are multiple different institutions that have kept parents in check.
And leaving aside that those institutions exist and that they do what they do, I think we're talking specifically about us as individuals. We're three three young adults who are going around the world, not
Middle-aged
kids.
That was funny. That was funny.
No, but my point
I'm
was...
glad you see yourself as middle-aged, Josh.
No, but Josh,
I self-identify as 40.
Josh, but my point was that before we think about our own actions that we might take towards in response to these styles of parenting, we need to recognize that there might be institutions that have a higher responsibility to respond to other parents or children than we do.
And I would agree that what the responsibilities of those institutions are, I think, is going to rapidly go beyond the scope of this one conversation. It may be a good option for future talk. I would say that generally speaking, and this I think is true on the institutional level, and it's true on the individual level, the first and foremost responsibility, and maybe the only responsibility of the individual and of the institution, is to speak truth. That can be done in a way that is loving and kind. It doesn't have to be going up to the face of a parent and yelling at them and saying, "You're a terrible, horrible parent, and here's all the reasons why." There's a kind and loving way to do that.
And I think not getting emotionally involved can help with that. Like, just
I would agree.
Learning how to tell the truth without letting emotion cloud your judgment.
Well, and this is something we can talk about in a broader discussion. But truth doesn't have an agenda. Truth doesn't. You don't. It's not your agenda to make somebody a good parent. If someone's a bad parent, they're a bad parent.
Am I gonna say it, or are you? Facts don't care about your feelings.
Well, we just got canceled. All right.
There was a few things I wanted to say, but I didn't. So if we're gonna do the cancellation thing.
Well, what are you expecting? Our audience is just gonna be, hey, I don't care who's in the audience. I think we should be able to say what we. Let's not get vulgar with it. Let's not get insulting with it. But let's say what we think.
Yeah.
Oh man. All right. Well, do we want to kind of wrap this up a little bit? I think we're probably around an hour and 15 minutes of good conversation here.
Yeah.
We can. Does anybody have any more thoughts on the topic before we kind of call it a day?
No, I think this is probably a pretty good place to end it. I think that anything beyond this is likely going to stem into a different and larger conversation about something else. So I'm comfortable with this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's wrap it up.
Well, thank you both, guys. It was a good conversation, and I think we will end the podcast right there. You've been listening to another Philosophical Tuesday, a production of the Intellectual Stooges. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next Tuesday for another episode.